Welcome back to part 2 for my advanced level memberships, members. Why am I stumbling with that? I'll cut that out. Maybe I won't. I'll just leave it in. I'm very grateful for your subscription, your support, for being part of my advanced membership, limited, exclusive, advanced. I can't speak today. This is what you get in your advanced membership subscription. You get me bumbling along with my painting. All right, let's get stuck into this. So this is probably day 2 or day 3. This is day 3. I've been away. I've been up to the Sierras and I've come back. And I am working on a very dry painting. And I can see clearly where I need to make my adjustments. I'm fine-tuning those. I've sat with images of the painting for a little while, and I felt as though those shadows in the water were too bold. So I'm tuning them down in their saturation just a little bit, and I'm bringing up some of the highlights. That whole area of water I felt had got too dark. And also the transition from the bottom of the image up to where the water itself meets that sand. I felt like it was too flat. So I'm adding a little bit of a value adjustment and bringing up some of the, instead of taking down the shadow areas, I'm bringing up some of the highlighted areas. I'm using an rosemary evergreen, flat evergreen, softer brush, just to feather in some of those changes. Now, this is the part I like. I'm usually pretty subtle with my corrections. I don't want to over influence the hue and the tone and the value of the painting, so it's just a matter of feathering on some of those fine adjustments onto the surface of the canvas. Drink a little water here because I'm getting dry. We've had all the fires here in California, so my throat, my voice box is suffering from all the smoke in the air. So I do apologize. Using my finger to blend. Don't advise doing that, but something that I've always done on the fly. I do a eek. You really don't want to be absorbing too much paint. Do as I say, not what I do, as I tell my children all the time. So right now I'm sort of stepping back a little bit and being very conscious of that plane. As you can see right now, I'm just feathering some of those angles of the surface of the water, because the painting underneath, scumbling, I think it's called. Just picking up the top tooth of the very fine linen and just dry brushing onto that surface of the painting to give some angle to the surface plane of the water. And I like that. It's almost as if I'm mimicking what's happening in reality. You know, you've got those colors coming from under the water, you've got the colors reflecting, and right now you've got a very fine highlight on the ripple of the water. So that's and that's enhancing the surface plane with those ripples. I like those angles. They were kind of just spreading from the center of the painting and gives a really nice bit of perspective. And I'm going in with a fine brush here, picking up some of the highlights, but again, accentuating the planes of those bits of seaweed that are protruding through the surface of the water, so they're in keeping with the surface and accentuating the perspective. There's no other elements there to accentuate the perspective, so I have to keep and be mindful of the planes of those little elements. And in fact, because they're so random, the shapes, they can quite easily like break any perspective. So I'm almost over exaggerating some of those planes to really enhance the water. I felt as though the ripples were a little bit too extreme, so I've just softened them back with my finger and a brush. But yeah, I'm feeling much better with the area of water there in the bottom right third of my painting. And I haven't done anything to the foliage on the left-hand side since my blocking in and my underpainting. So it's time just to work that shaded area or where the reflections from the land and the shadow from the land meet the water there. In the shadow, you see right through to the silt and the sand underneath. So there's a lot of ochre that's going to come through, greenish kind of ochre that's going to come through in that shadow. I'm allowing myself a bit of flexibility in this portion of the painting to move a little away from my complementary colors. Just in the majority of the painting now is in those two complementary colors, the blue and the oranges, or the yellow oranges, and I've adhered to the palette that I choose right now because I'm working in just small blobs. I'm giving myself a little bit more flexibility to bring in some of the more saturated greens, just dabs of saturated greens, and also a little bit more purple so that I can tune the shadows and the highlights. Just to make it a little bit more vibrant. As I say, a lot of work goes into this detail portion of correcting and fine-tuning. You don't see the big changes you see initially when I'm blocking in. But I think, you know, this is the point when one brush stroke can make or break the painting. I can already see the water plane come alive now because we're seeing into that shadow, and you can see what's under the water, and it's tying that area in with the rest of the reflected area, bottom right third, and really enhancing the diagonal going from the bottom left hand side of the painting right up to the center of the painting and over to the middle right hand side of that painting. Until now, you know, it felt as though that was part of the foliage, but you can clearly see that it's gluing the water together. There's not going to be a lot of blue in that area because it's all in reflection or shadow. Reflection, I should say. Reflection of the foliage rather than the sky. So there's nothing in terms of blue going to be in that little quadrant of reflection, surface reflection. Took a little break there just to make sure that my audio file was being saved. Okay, starting to work those textures. Excuse me, of the reeds or the grasses over on the left hand side. working down some of my shadows. Keeping my shadows mostly that phthalo blue mixed with a little bit of burnt umber. So they're cool, darker shadows. You can make a real nice black with a burnt umber, ultramarine and a red. It's a cooler, I feel like it's a cooler black with using that phthalo. And since I don't really have a red on my palette, just a dab of that alizarin. It makes a nice dark tone value. So that looks like purple. It is slightly purple, but is mostly grey. It only looks purple because it's next to the greens, and obviously complementary color of green is red, so it's making that red, that grey, that fairly neutral grey, bluish grey, look more purple than what it is, I think. I didn't use a lot of warm tone in that grey. And in fact, I use grey so much more than I used to in my paintings. When in doubt, I grey it out and then I build up the saturation. Generally, my paintings, if something looks off, it's usually, or feels off, it's usually its value or the intensity of the saturation. So I've started to go to desaturating the color as default until I've got more information in the painting, and then I can raise the intensity of the color. But more often than not, I don't. Just when I look at a color, I'm like, oh, okay, it's that color, and I usually go in way too heavy-handed with the saturation of that color. These days, I'm always, I'll always mix if it doesn't feel right, I'll always mix a little bit of its complementary on my palette to make it more grey and to desaturate it. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. When you saturate something, it tends to pop out or stand out. So if something stands out too much, it's either too light, too dark, or too intense. So, and if you don't immediately know which one of those it is, grey it out first and then adjust its value if that's not working as well. But sometimes it's just, it's too intense because you haven't brought in any of the other colors. So err on the, safe side by desaturating it, and then you can always raise the saturation. Sometimes if you start too high, then the whole image itself ends up being too intense, and then you just lose any of the benefit. The other thing that I've been doing, which I love, and I never used to do, is whether or not I see it in the painting itself or in the reference image or in reality, whether or not I see it, I like to add little dots of complementary color to masses. Not so much that you can see them stand out, but more almost like pointillism, more to kind of ease the color over to a little bit cooler or a little bit warmer. So for instance, I felt as though, as I was getting through this painting, it felt as though that big greeny blue ochre mass of foliage on the left-hand side didn't have any personality. It felt all a little bit too, here's a big mass of green, or here's a big mass of ochreish green. And it didn't really have any personality. So I took a very small brush and I added little dots of purple to the shadow area, and not so much that you could see them immediately, but it caused a vibration in my eye, and it just made that area just come alive a little bit more. So I feel like I got a lot of that from looking at Edgar Payne's work. It seemed as though he would always just add little dots of complementary colour to big masses of muted colour, just to give some excitement. And I'll point out when I start doing that, I don't think you can see it in the video, but it's definitely there in the actual painting itself. You know, just little blobs of intense purple, tiny little blobs of intense purple in amongst big areas of similar colour. And it's almost the opposite effect to when I'm doing my skies. Quite often, if I've done my ground colour as complementary to the sky, in this particular painting I didn't do it so much, but in my plein air work, I often let a little bit of the ground come through, just tiny little bits come through behind the blue to make it vibrate, to make it appear to like vibrate to the eye. And Edgar Payne does that an awful lot. He doesn't just block in the sky. He'll put marks on the sky, but leave tiny bits of the ground, usually an orangey, warm, reddish ground, just come through that, and it just, whoa, brings the painting alive. Right here, I'm working some of the details. I've got a very small brush, and I'm holding it right at the end. Let my wrist do the painting. I also use a lot of my old cut up fan brushes to accentuate the texture in the foreground there. Like I say, I retired a few fan brushes and then I just went in and chopped them with a scissors so that the marks they make are really organic, sometimes just like single bristle marks. This is where I felt as though that area down there. See, I was trying to figure out what was wrong. I felt like, I don't know, it just seems all really like one tone, one hue. So I stepped away from it a little bit. I'm trying to fix it. Very lightly using that cut up brush. Just getting surface texture, just like individual little bristle marks. Really working with the texture down there in the foreground. Trying not to lighten it too much. You know, quite often I'll end up just changing the entire value by trying to add little highlights and details. I did need it to come forward though. If I felt like it was just because it was dark, it was sitting way too far back in the painting and it just didn't have anything. Right now you can see it's almost like it's bringing the entire thing, that entire area, to the foreground, which is what I needed to do. Yeah, I'm afraid you can't really see what I was talking about adding those tiny little touches of complementary colour, little dots of complementary colour into that green. But you just have to take my word for it. It's a really nice, useful tool. This is that fan brush I was talking about. Nice. I love the texture of that fan brush. I'm using it more and more often. I didn't know if I wanted to be a texture painter. You know, I'm still on the fence as to whether or not this is something that I should be doing in my paintings. You know, Edgar Payne managed to make some incredible paintings just using like blocks of colour and avoided, you know, going into texture too detail. But this is just something, a remnant of the amount of detail that I would put into my figurative work, and, you know, it's coming over into my paintings. I get carried away because it does have a nice organic feel to it, so I end up just maybe overworking those textures too much. But it serves some paintings, not so much others. intensifying the orange there. And now now you can see the contrast between the orange and the purple. You know, the grey that I was talking about. Now that grey's coming alive a little bit more because of it. It's, you know, how the relativity to the colour next to it. I'm working on just some of those shapes to make sure that I felt like I lost a little bit of the diagonal slant of the land there. So I'm just bringing out some of those angles to make sure that it feels as though the land continues down to meet that water's edge. Just using a fine brush, set back some of those. I lost a little bit of the shadow there, so I'm just setting back some of those shaded areas. Push pull, fine tune, tiny little brush. Add in a bit of blue to those. I felt like the shadow was too heavy there, so I'm cooling out that shadow just a little bit with in the darkest area there in the painting. Adding little dots of blue and purple, making this, you know, it's adjusting the shadow. It's like the shadow's like this neutral dark black, and you start putting little dots of cool color into that area. Not enough to affect its value, but just enough to trick the eye into thinking that it's cooler, and it has a remarkable effect. Just popping back up to the tree. I felt as though I'd softened it too much, and I'd lost some of the branches. Really wanted those branches to feel realistic, as though they were holding up the little masses or the bunches of foliage there. And the angle and the character of the tree was really important. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, those sky holes, but also the foliage, as it gets closer to the sky, is going to get slightly lighter. As you know, as it rolls over the top of the tree, it's facing the light source a little bit more, so it's going to get a little lighter towards the transition. So making sure that the tree doesn't just end harsh and the sky starts real light harsh, you know, always visually blends because of the way that our eye processes light and dark. You know, when you look to an area which is very light, if you look into it, you'll see a sharp line. But if you blur your eyes just a little bit, squint just a little bit, that harsh line really diffuses. And that's what you want if you want to make the image look and work effectively. So I wasn't going to bring in that little palm tree, but I felt like I needed to break up that bit of grass there and almost make the palm tree as a bit of a focal point. You know, because your eye always naturally follows the line of where the water meets the land. And it just felt as though the land wasn't doing anything right there. And that blob of grass that was sticking out, I still couldn't get a handle on making that recede. So I wanted to break that up by adding a little bit of a palm tree. And what's nice about this little palm tree, one of the fronds goes all the way down to the water, and then the shadow, or the reflection of that frond, I don't know which it is. You can correct me in your comments. The reflection of that glues that area to the water and helps with that strange block of blue and grass. So watch this now. As that frond just touches the water, and then the shadow, see that there? the reflection, I should say, not the shadow, really helps with that area that just felt a little bit like too garish. Also now I'm bringing up a little bit of highlight on those rocks where they meet the water's edge, softening the value on the highlight, which is a bit too much. Feels way more organic now as the land comes down and meets the water. I decided to try and see what it would like if I put an individual on the beach, because in my reference image there were people there. And recently I made a painting where I added cows to my scene because there were cows there, and I was shying away from adding animals to or figures to the painting. It didn't work. It just kind of ruined the composition, so I took it away. One of the other things I felt as well is the highlights on the water were too white, very neutral, whereas the light in the painting was kind of that warmish yellow. So I glazed a transparent layer of orange on top of those highlighted areas, and then brought back some of the highlights, less of them. So the highlight of the on the waves there, I gave it a hue, which felt really nice and in keeping with the overall light of the painting. Just brought out some of the highlights on as the water actually broke onto the shore there. And just that line, see how I've brought up the value of those light areas? I think just that alone has made a huge difference to the painting. Bringing in some aqua glazes to in between the waves, that real intense, green, aqua green you see when the light passes through thin sheets of water, especially as the wave comes over, the light passes through and really boosts that kind of aqua green feel. You'd have to see the final image in order to notice that. Trying to fix that blob. Felt as though that blob was just too much of a blob. So I'm just changing some of the shape. And like I said earlier in my painting process, really enhancing some of the textures in that blob to break it down. I feel like that little bush sticking out from the front of the rock, that palm bush, has broken it up as well, and it doesn't make it into such a mute feature in the center of the painting. Definitely draws your eye away from just that block of green and makes it more. I want to soften that edge, or I should say change the angle of that edge just a little bit so that it flows into the water a bit better. Getting pretty close to the end of the image here. I do go back in. You see that reflection of the land in the water? Almost in the center, lower center of the painting. That's a little bit too harsh. I go back into that maybe 2 or 3 hours later. I felt as though I photographed it and I felt as though that was too sharp. So with my finger, I just kind of rubbed and diffused that. It didn't echo the angle of the land as the land was coming down into the water. It looked like it was too vertical. So I just washed that out after the fact, but you don't see any of that at this point. So I'm stepping away, taking a lot of time just to look at the painting, see if something feels wrong, see if it feels right, come back in. I felt as though that sky there was the wrong color, in fact. I felt like it had too much purple in it. So fix that. I also felt as if the horizon was just a little bit too dark. So I bring up the value, and this also makes a huge difference. It's not a lot of work, but watch now as I lighten that horizon just a little bit. Sends the eye way back. Yeah, that was the right thing to do. So just add in a little bit of light. And I feel as though now my perspective is much better. It felt as though that was just flat. It's a flat area. So don't tell anybody, but I think that horizon on the left-hand side there is just a little bit too low. So I'm just trying to correct that. Looks like it steps down behind the tree. But again, I did it all like super fluid. So I think I'm done with the painting. Just sitting there looking at the piece. Really just letting my eye relax and scanning over the entire work. Clean my brushes, go away, come back to it again. See if anything just pops out. Yeah, that didn't feel... at this point, there's a lot of time and not a lot of actual painting. This is where the final little adjustments are. All in all, though, I'm pretty happy with the painting. This is the final piece. Yeah, well, thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you. I hope you learned something from the tutorial. I'm thrilled with how the painting came. It's available on my website to purchase. You can purchase it framed or unframed. If you're interested, share it with your friends. This is my studio painting and tutorial of said studio painting, Topanga Beach in Malibu, based on a study. And like I said, what's most exciting about this painting was I used a very limited complementary palette for the entire painting. So thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you for supporting. I hope you are getting something from these tutorials. Please, please, please continue with your feedback. It helps me learn, it helps me grow, and it helps me provide you with what you would need in these tutorials, whether you are here to learn to paint or whether or not you just enjoy the process of painting. I am deeply grateful for your support. Much love, take care, and I'll see you next time. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.